Today on Accidental Experts with Bryce Hamilton.
Welcome to the Accidental Experts podcast. I'm your host, Bryce Hamilton. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a child and family therapist. I have been in practice for over 15 years, and I'm also a mom of 4. So I know the challenges both professionally and personally. I'm so glad that you're here today to grow your parenting toolbox. Please come as you are and be ready to learn. My goal is to make you the accidental expert so that you can raise healthy humans. Hi guys, welcome back. I'm so excited that you're here today. We're going to be talking about a topic that is sensitive, but so important. So we're going to be talking about sexual violence, which Dr. Nicole Bedera is going to explain to us. She's a sociologist and she has been researching this population for many years, and she has several publications as well as a book that's come out. And she's going to help us understand how to protect our kids, what we need to know about sexual violence, and what the research shows, and what we can do to help keep our kids safe. With that, let's get to Nicole.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. And I want to say from the beginning that this is a topic that can be hard, but I just want listeners to know that the way we're going to talk about it is intended to make it feel easy. In so many of my conversations about this, my goal is really for survivors to feel like some burdens are lifted off their shoulders, like they're taking a weighted blanket off, and understanding why this violence takes place, who's really at fault, all of these types of things to understand them better. And so if people are listening to this and they're like, oh my God, this is going to be a really hard conversation. Yes, but hopefully one of the things you'll take away from it is a feeling of being lighter, which I think is a kind of a rarity in these conversations about sexual violence.
Well, and I think to go along with that, I think sometimes when we're listening to hard stuff, we take a pause, right? And then come back to it. And so feel free to pause and come back as you need to, because I think we're going to cover some really important stuff. And we've been chatting previous to our interview and I have learned already so much. So I am so thankful that Nicole is here.
Thank you. I'm excited to dive in.
Yes. Okay. So in researching ahead of this, I understand your work really focuses on understanding how social structures and the culture contribute to sexual violence, which is such a fascinating thing to me. Can you explain how systems create an environment where violence becomes predictable and even ordinary?
Yeah. So most of my research has been on college campuses. Not because I think college campuses are special, not because I think they're particularly important places, although I do, or because I think that they're particularly violent places, although they are. But the reason that I study them is because they're sort of the gateway to adulthood for the most privileged and powerful people in our society. So I'm interested in what happens on campus, but I'm also interested in the way that sets the norms for adulthood everywhere else. And so that means, by definition, anything that a university campus is doing to address sexual violence or not is an example of how it's creating a culture around our expectations about what sexual violence response should look like, or whether sexual violence is accepted at all. But the other thing that's nice about studying a college campus is it's like studying a whole city at once. A lot of our large universities, they have so many different majors. People live on campus, they work on campus, they get their food on campus, their friends are on campus. It's where you go to see concerts, it's where you go to see sporting events. And so you can see all these different parts of a really vibrant, really, in some ways, diverse society. And what researchers have found on these college campuses is that you are not at equal risk of sexual assault just by stepping foot on campus. It depends on where you are and who you're around. So, for example, a huge amount of sexual violence perpetrated on campus, especially among students, come from men who are engaged in specific spaces that are competitive, hierarchical, and they exclude women from participation. So we're talking about places like fraternities, also sports teams. One study found that half of men on college athletics teams have committed a sexual assault by graduation, half. And so if you think about how many people there are, if you think about the sexual assault rate by comparison, that's a huge share already. but also places that informally exclude women from them. And the one that comes to mind for me is there's research on college marching bands that you wouldn't think of as these really
Yes.
masculine spaces. But if you've been in a band, then you know that there are certain instruments that are dominated by women and certain instruments that are mostly played by men, and that there is a ranking process of, are you first chair, second, so on and so forth. Which ensemble are you in? Are you in the most prestigious or the least prestigious? Marching bands actually have a lot of the same norms as these other spaces that are dangerous on campus, and they're one of the places where sexual violence is really common as well. And so this is just sort of an example of thinking about how social context plays a role. Because if there's one thing, there are a lot of things that I want people to take away from this conversation. But one of them is that a lot of perpetrators of sexual violence are not necessarily pathological. It's not something about their personality that leads them to commit violence. It's their proximity to men who hold misogynistic views, who are encouraging them to commit violence. And that's especially true on a college campus. So part of how we can tell that is because when these men are in different settings, they don't commit violence anymore. They do it when they're trying to impress their peers. They're doing it when that's the norm among all of their friends. And so that's what I mean when I say that there are some environments that are more conducive to violence, that have made violence feel normal and acceptable, like everybody is doing it, versus other spaces. We've been talking about the bad part of this, but the flip side is there are other spaces on campus that are almost entirely safe, where the risk of violence is so low because of the values held by the people within those parts of campus. I always hesitate to name those, because as soon as you name a place safe, perpetrators will appear there. But it is true that there are high risk and low risk spaces, and that there are some places where there's a lot of violence in society and some places where there's almost none.
Yeah. So without naming a place, like what could we look for? If I'm a college woman and I'm getting ready to go to college, I'm returning to college, I'm thinking about like the spaces that I'm putting myself in, that not that I should be allowed. I always say to people, you should be allowed to go down the street naked and nothing happened to you. I truly believe that. However, I will not be walking down the street naked. I think, we should be allowed to do that without catcalls or any type of comment. More concerned, like, hey, is she okay? Like, is something wrong? Like, let's call somebody to help her, right? Or go see if she needs a blanket or something, right? And since our society does, expect clothing in public places, but I'm thinking about like what could we be looking for that might help us to pick out spaces that would be more safe?
So it's just the opposite of what I already said, which is, instead of competitive, spaces that are collaborative.
Okay.
Instead of hierarchical, places where power is shared. And instead of places that are dominated by men, we want to think about places where women are treated as equals. And I use that instead of saying dominated by women, because places like sororities or women's athletics teams where there's been sex segregation actually tend to be really risky spaces, because the reason they've been segregated out is because of their exclusion by men, right? The reason we have a sorority system is because there was a fraternity system first. The reason why we have women's athletics is because there were men's athletics first. And so those are actually not places that are really treating women as equal. These are places that are sex segregated, and that's a different thing. So you're looking for places that are really gender egalitarian. And so on different campuses, those will be different things, because it really, all of these spaces are created by the people who are within them. So there are some spaces that you can probably think of from your own campus where you think, yeah, that was actually a really comfortable, safe space for me. Everybody was so wonderful. And someone else listening to this might have been in the same space, but there was more competition there, or there was one person who came in, especially if a perpetrator is in a position of power. I'm thinking of professors when I say this, but a professor, really has a huge amount of decision making over whether, for example, the women's studies department is going to be a safe haven, or if there's going to be a single powerful male, usually professor, who's creating a hostile environment. So that's part of why I hesitate to say this place is safe and this place is not. But if you think about those components of where are people collaborating with each other, where is there not one powerful person, but there are lots of people who are sharing power, and where do you feel valued as a woman? Those are the places that are probably the safest.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay, so when we look at sexual violence, a lot of times we think about it being like an isolated incident between two individuals of like it just happened or it was an accident or they didn't mean to do it. How does your research challenge this perspective? And why do we need to use what you have learned in the research to help us understand this?
Well, first, I'll say that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. Researchers have known since the 80s that sexual violence is never a miscommunication. It is never an accident. And I truly mean never, because sexual violence is a crime of power inequality. So if two people are, on totally equal footing with each other and somebody crosses the other person's boundary by accident, then that person whose boundary was crossed would have no problem saying, oops, like, please don't do that. And the other person would respond. Before I did the research for the book that I had come out last year, I did research on men's experiences seeking consent. And one of the big findings from that project was that they are not confused by consent. They can define it very clearly. They can tell when it's present and absent. And that a lot of what they're more invested in is creating this narrative in which consent feels ambiguous, in part as a way to let their friends off the hook for their friends' bad behavior. Mm-hmm. And so that's a really different problem than people saying, I don't know how to make sure that the sex I'm having is consensual. And I always think about this one participant who I interviewed during that project, who I just thought put it so well, which is he knew with complete certainty that he would never commit an act of sexual assault because he said he would never be in control over his partner, that he would always be trying to share power. And that's really all you have to do. Mm-hmm. All you have to do is, he gave the example of if I lean in for a kiss, I'm not going to keep forcing that person to kiss me. I'm not going to keep being the initiator. I'm going to pull my head back. And I'm going to see if my partner then leans in to keep kissing me, looking for both verbal and nonverbal signs that someone is comfortable or not. One of the things I found in my research, so part of why we're talking is because I had a book come out, and the book is called On the Wrong Side: How Universities Protect Perpetrators and Betray Survivors of Sexual Violence. And as part of that project, I got to interview the victims, the perpetrators, and the school administrators who made decisions in those cases. And when I was interviewing the perpetrators, the first question I would ask them was, when you heard from your school's, Title IX office or whatever other office was involved in sexual violence proceedings, I would say, when you got that email, did you know what it was about? Overwhelmingly, the answer is yes. Mm. With perhaps a little caveat in the case of really prolific serial perpetrators who would have a few potential options of which victim might be coming forward. But even then, they still had a pretty good guess based off of which violent act had been the most recent. Mm-hmm. And so it was clear to me from my conversations with men in both of these research contexts that they're not confused and that they have a whole lot of certainty about what they've done. And part of why we think that's not true is because they defend themselves when they do commit acts of sexual violence by saying that they were just confused, by rationalizing their actions in a way they think we will be sympathetic to. And for a lot of men, one of those tactics is to try to invert the power dynamic. So one of the ways that they'll do that is by trying to make themselves look really young and make it look like their victim is actually the one who's older, more powerful, even if that's not the reality. We see this in the time, in celebrity cases where we have, for example, Jay-Z just made a statement, there's this big conversation about allegations that he has sexually abused teenagers in the past. And one of the statements he put out was calling himself a young boy at the time and saying that he was so young when actually the people who are coming forward as victims are the ones that were young at the time and he was an adult. So it's not necessarily based in reality, but that's why they'll draw on a lot of this rhetoric to make it sound like I just didn't know better. I just didn't have the education I needed. I am this, young, confused person. And what they're hoping is that the listener will just take that at face value instead of saying, is that true? Are you the young person here? Are you the person who didn't know better here? Or do we think you should have known better, even if you didn't? But instead for us to say, oh, he's saying that he's childlike, so I'm going to treat him like a child. And children get second chances. Children, can't go to prison, all these different things that they think about. And so that's how I see that rhetoric now about miscommunication, is that it's all about finding a way to get us to be more comfortable with the violence that occurred and to give a perpetrator a second chance, whether or not they've done anything to deserve it.
Yeah. Well, and one thing I hear when you talk about administrators that I'd love to hear your thoughts on are sometimes they'll say things like, I don't want to ruin their life, or like their life will be ruined. And I mean, I have a hard time with that mentality regardless, because if you did something that was not right, there's a consequence to that. And regardless, there should be a consequence. But I think that's something that people do take into consideration of, like, they don't want to ruin this person's life. Do you have thoughts on that?
I have so many thoughts on that. There are a couple of things I want to touch on.
Yes.
First, I want to talk about this language of a life being ruined because it came up a lot in the research. It was something that school administrators would say all the time when they were talking about reasons not not in situations where they didn't know what happened. I think that's what a lot of people picture because there's this idea that there's never enough evidence, that it's a he said, she said, and that everybody's making their best judgment call. That's not what I found. In my research, I actually found the opposite. I found that there was an overwhelming amount of evidence. I think out of everything in doing research for the book, this is the thing I was most surprised by, is how much evidence there is in sexual assault cases, which is kind of wild because before I did this work as a researcher, I used to be a victim advocate in the hospitals for forensic exams, or rape kits, as a lot of people know them. And so I was seeing evidence evaluated then too. But I think something about seeing it in this context, it just felt totally different. I think also the Me Too movement led me to see it a little bit differently, that we had this big national conversation about the types of things that could be used as evidence and expanded that a little bit. But anyway, this is a long way of saying that these aren't scenarios where we don't know what happened. These are scenarios where administrators do know what happened. They do know a rape occurred, and they are looking for a reason to not do anything about it. And what they would say is, I don't want to ruin his life. And they would say that as a way of giving their empathy to the perpetrator, which requires taking it away from the victim. That's not a neutral thing to do. That's not something where you can support both people, because the needs of the two people are in direct competition with each other. The main reason that victims come forward about sexual violence in their schools is because they can no longer share campus space with their perpetrator. It's not safe for them, either physically or psychologically safe for them. And so they're starting to give up things that they should be able to do as part of their education. They're avoiding specific buildings on campus. They're feeling like they have to drop out of specific classes that their perpetrator wanted to take too. They feel like they have to change their major. And that's not really fair for someone who's been sexually assaulted to then say, oh, and as the result of your sexual assault, please also change your major and stay away from anywhere your perpetrator wants to be. Now he gets access to the rest of campus and you make yourself small. That's not fair. And so school administrators, as a way to justify not doing anything, would make it sound as if those sacrifices from the victim just weren't a big deal in comparison to a whole life being ruined. But one of the things I found from my research is that these men's lives were not ruined, that for the most part, anybody who reads the book can see this in a lot of detail following some of these perpetrators over the course of their cases and the time afterward. But a lot of the time they were benefited. And one of the issues, whenever you hear anybody say, I don't want his life to be ruined, is they're acting, I think, from a good, if we give them like the benefit of good faith, and what they're trying to do is say, everyone is going to take the victim's side because this violence is wrong. I expect our social response to be strong against it. And so I don't want the perpetrator to have nobody on their side. That seems unfair. But in reality, we don't have a strong social response to violence. And everyone was thinking this way. And that's what I was seeing in the research, is if one administrator had felt that way, then maybe it would have been okay. But actually, all the administrators were saying that same phrase, and they were doing the same thing. And it was the victim who everyone was withdrawing support from because they were busy feeling really bad for the perpetrator.
Yeah.
But the other thing I want to touch on is what you said about how there should be consequences for violence, because there should be, and there are, that we can't make the consequences of violence go away. The reason why all of this stuff is a crime is because it leaves a traumatic impact. And that traumatic impact has a social impact. And so the decision we have isn't, will this hurt somebody or not? That's done. The perpetrator made that decision for everybody. There are already consequences. The decision we have is who's going to bear those consequences. You know, I already kind of jumped the gun and talked about this before, but in the case of a victim and a perpetrator who want to take the same class and they can't safely be in the same room anymore, the question really is, who's dropping the class? There's no world in which both of them can sit safely in this class. That is not a reasonable thing to expect, even though a lot of people think it is. It's not a real option. And if you push people into that option, the victim will almost always be the one to leave or be more traumatized than they would have been otherwise. And so we do have to be brave. We do have to make that decision and put the consequences for the violence on the person who chose to be violent, as opposed to the victim who didn't choose to be there by definition.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about this, and I know your studies were mostly on college campuses, but I think this is also sometimes an adult, like this is how we respond to adults, like in court, right? Outside of college campuses, but I'm also thinking in like middle schools and high schools,
Yeah.
right? Like it's happening everywhere. What can you say to what do you think administrators should be thinking? Like what words do you think might motivate them to do what we're suggesting is the right thing and being supportive of the victim, right? And less concerned or not concerned about the consequences for the perpetrator?
I think one of those things is just to give people permission to think about perpetrators less and to center them less and to actually call out that this idea that, these perpetrators' lives will be ruined, it is a myth. They're going to be okay. Even in the cases, there were 2 cases in my entire year at this university that ended in a meaningful sanction. And so in both of those cases, both of the perpetrators were fine. They were thriving. In the one case of a perpetrator who was expelled, he had been admitted to another university for the next semester. So he did not have a single moment of educational disruption. Whereas his victim, because he'd been so violent, administrators had recommended to her that she should take a leave of absence because they were not going to protect her safety. They felt that that wasn't something that they could do. I would quibble with that, obviously, but she ended up taking a 2-year leave of absence. So I give this example as just a way to say that this myth of ruining lives is really backwards, that every time there was all of this focus on, part of why this investigation took 2 years is because there was a desire to protect the perpetrators and shield him from the consequences of his actions. But in reality, he was fine. Even in the case of the expulsion, he was fine. And so I think that's something that people need to hear, that we are not living in a society where people will not get a second chance. If anything, people will get second chances they don't deserve when they are the perpetrators of this type of violence. The other thing I'll say is that I think people are lacking a little creativity, that some of the solutions that would be helpful to survivors are just so much simpler than people think. And that there's a real hesitancy to do these things, even though they're really simple. So thinking about K through 12 schools, for example, most K through 12 schools, if you have a victim and perpetrator who are the same age in the same class, most of them have another section of that class. And it would be so easy to just put the perpetrator in the other section. It would be so simple. Things like that are just really off the table for whatever reason. That's, I think, one of the things that was most vexing to me about the research is victims would make these reports needing really specific things, like to not have to share a classroom with their perpetrator because it was distracting from their schoolwork. And schools would kind of throw their hands in the air and say, well, we don't have a process for that. And my response as a researcher is, well, build a process for that. This is a really reasonable thing to have a process for. And I'll say right now, I imagine there's some listeners, well, there must be a law, there must be a reason. There must be a reason they don't have these really obvious processes. And no, there is not. That under Trump's approach, as well as Biden's, which has now been vacated, so we're only talking about Trump's approach now, but schools have never had so much power to choose how they want to address sexual violence. A lot of these decisions are left entirely in their hands, which from a legislative perspective is what they wanted, because they wanted to be able to decide what to do. But now they're trying to convince us that their hands are tied, and their hands are very much not tied. Parents listening to this, I think this is something that you should really take home from this conversation, is that if you want to change the way these things are handled in your own school district, there are no rules that say that you can't do the sensible thing. There are no rules that say that we have to be so deferential to these potential needs of perpetrators. And I'll say the other thing, when we're talking about children, they respond to this stuff differently than we would expect. I'm thinking of an experience from my personal life. Right now, doing this research, people talk to me all the time when people
Mhm.
they love are accused of sexual assault. And the story that's coming to mind right now is sort of a friend of a friend's child had, you know, engaged in something that would count as sexual harassment in his classroom. He was 8 at the time. And his parents leapt into, we're going to sue the school for investigating him. We're going to protect our baby boy. We can't let them treat him this way. This is so unfair. And the thing I had to say back to the parents was, he is 8. You could just tell him why it's not okay. The school was only, they'd given him a detention session. That was it.
Mhm.
Very, very lenient. And so to say, actually, this is why this is important. These are our values. These are education moments that, especially with young kids, they are not entrenched in these cultural issues the same way the rest of us are. And so you really do get a blank slate. And so just explaining why it's not okay to touch girls in your class this way is often enough to
Mhm.
be able to change things. But one of the big issues that came up in the research for the book, as well as our just public discourse about sexual violence, it really is often the mothers of rapists who are the ones pushing to get these protections for rapists. I think there's this idea that the men's rights movement has been full of men who are trying to advance these causes for themselves. But in the case of campus sexual violence, it's been their mothers who have done almost all the work for them. And so on one hand, that's enraging and upsetting. And on the other way, it's a reminder that when there are young children in our lives, we have a huge amount of power to shape what they think of as right and what is an appropriate response in their schools. And we can use that power for good or evil. And
Mhm.
it's past time we start using it for good.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm as somebody who's also raising 2 boys, I think, that really resonates with me of like there are so many opportunities for all my kids, the girls too, but so many opportunities to talk about what behavior is expected, what our family expectations are, right? Like if you put your hands on your sister, like that's not allowed, right? Like just redirecting and saying, this is why we feel this way. And I think a lot of, I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine that people who are perpetrators are having experiences early in life that they're basically being shielded from consequences, and or their victims are not coming forward, but like the consequences are kind of being wiped away, and so they don't ever learn anything to make a different choice. Is there some truth to that?
That certainly seemed to be true with the perpetrators in this study.
Yeah.
That because they were shielded from their consequences, they were not rethinking their behavior. If anything, they were feeling more justified and vindicated in what they had done, that
Mhm.
they felt in many cases like they were righteous, and they became more sexist. And they came to
Mhm.
see, oh, this is something that these girls are doing to me, that these women are doing to me, and I'm the unfair victim in all of this, which isn't really the ideology that we want our boys to grow up having, right? We don't want them
Yeah.
to look at a situation that was totally in their control and then to feel like it wasn't in their control.
Mhm.
Um, Certainly, if they're going to continue to be violent too. And I think another thing that can be helpful, whether you're a school administrator or your parent, is thinking through what appropriate consequences are. And this is something I talk about a lot in the book, is the difference between punishment and consequences. And I use it from an abolitionist framework. And so one of the big differences is punishment is really inflicting cruelty or suffering.
Mhm.
It's something that doesn't have a purpose. It's not intended to have consequences. It's just meant to make someone miserable. And so when I think of examples of some of the things that are punishment, I think about something that's totally unrelated to the
Mhm.
violence, right? So um, follow me a little bit. But one of the ones that I talk about a lot is, I gave that example of somebody who got detention. Like, what does a detention do if all you're doing is sitting in timeout? How is that benefiting the victim? How is that addressing the natural
Mhm.
consequences of sexual violence? It really isn't. Same thing with education measures. A lot of schools right now are trying to introduce these education measures, which, the school that I studied had them, and I saw them as a form of punishment because they are not found to be effective. And
Mhm.
when you look at what they are, it sounds great on paper. Oh, we're going to educate people. We're going to change their behavior, but they don't change their behavior. And a lot of the time, what they were was just sitting with the perpetrator in a room, reminding them of the definition of sexual assault asking if they had any questions and sending them on their way. Whereas researchers know that an effective educational intervention is ideally done in advance, and it requires a minimum of 10 sessions. A minimum of 10 sessions to be effective. So I think of things, whether it's the suspension or like an educational one-time training, I see both of these things as punishment. I see that as not an appropriate response to sexual violence. In contrast, consequences is recognizing the natural consequences to the behavior that took place. And that could be consequences for the victim. So again, to go back to a really simple example, if victim and perpetrator don't want to be in the same place, I think it's a very reasonable natural consequence for the rest of that perpetrator's life to say, if they are going to end up in the same place as the victim, that they turn around and leave forever, because the impact they've had on that victim is also forever. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I felt strongly about after my research, seeing these perpetrators, there was so much focus on what happens if they leave this one school, and then seeing the one perpetrator who was expelled just go to another school. I had this realization of like, there's a whole big world. If we say you can't be in the same place as your victim, that means the rest of the world is available. We've said you can't be in one spot at any given time. That is such a reasonable set of consequences. Mm-hmm. But the other thing I think about too is if there are people who can't be trusted. And I think anyone who's perpetrated an act of sexual violence, we have to start from a place of distrust, not from a place of hoping or assuming that they will change, because then they really have no incentive to change, right? We have to demand that we see some change before we expect that change will happen. And in those scenarios, I think stripping them of some power. I do feel strongly that somebody who has abused power in the workplace, for example, should not have a position where they have people working directly under them, where they have unilateral power. They should be working in a job where they do not get to have, a supply of victims as part of their work, where they can, threaten to hire or fire them as a way to require sexual subservience. And I feel the same way about students, that if they're in a powerful position or a high status position on campus while perpetrating violence, I think it's really reasonable to say you can't do that anymore. If the student had been the class president, to say that's not a value we want our class president to have, that's disqualifying from this position of power. Mm-hmm. I feel the same way about athletics teams. I think that's the only way that we get our athletic teams to be safer, is to make them places that are intolerant of sexual violence. And I'll say that is what the research finds, that the places where sexual violence doesn't occur are the places where it's not tolerated, where if it happens, people say, all right, you know what? There are a lot of people who would want to be on this team, and we're going to choose the ones who are nonviolent. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to thinking about these consequences, I think hear what is needed, thinking about the victims and centering the victims the whole way, including the current victim who, studies find, again, I'll keep saying it because it's important, but the number one thing that victims want almost universally is to never be in the same room as their perpetrator again, to never share space with them in any way again. I think that's the minimum we can do. And then I think thinking about other potential victims too, assuming that the behavior has not changed, and saying there are some consequences where you can't be trusted with power. And if we just did those two things with perpetrators, I think we would see a big difference in the next generation of children.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm just imagining, if you did something and that's, perpetrating against somebody else with sexual violence, and then you lost something that you'd worked hard for, that would be a real deterrent. Like, I am going to get caught. So can perpetrators change?
It's hard to say, because we're sort of in hypothetical land, right? Because for the most part, we don't hold perpetrators accountable. Yeah. And so the question of if we hold them accountable, will they change? On paper, it makes sense they could. Mm-hmm. That's what I'll say. On paper, it makes sense that they could. What we do know about perpetrators who stop perpetrating is that one of the best predictors is that they are no longer around the negative social influences that made their perpetration feel normal. And this is one of the reasons why I'm actually really pro-expulsion for perpetrators, because if a perpetrator has to leave the school they're at and go start fresh somewhere else, there's a chance they might make better friends. There's a chance that they might make better choices than if you continue to keep them in the exact same scenario they were in with the same social group. The chance that they're going to change is a lot lower. And that's something I say to people when someone they know and love has perpetrated sexual assault too. There are a lot of people who will say, well, don't they need somebody right now to help them change? And the thing I always say back is, if you knew them before, there's a good chance that you are not someone who can get them to change. because you were in that social network. And one of the best predictors is that social network. And so whether you were someone who was looking the other way or someone who was encouraging the violence or justifying it or pretending it didn't happen or whatever else, you probably need to end this relationship too. And so this is kind of like a long way of saying that the thing we know is most likely to change perpetrators is big change in their lives. And some of that might be accountability, really intentional accountability measures. And some of it is just change. One of the things we see with, for example, men who perpetrate sexual violence when they're in fraternities is some of them graduate and they don't hang out with their fraternity brothers anymore and they just stop. It did not take some big social intervention. They are just around a different social group who has different norms. And so some of it's accountability, maybe, we hope, but more likely just shaking up their lives is, in terms of things that are empirically validated now and that we know work now, I'd say that that's one of the things to try. And so, going back to the example of being a parent, if your son is committing acts of sexual violence, changing the activities he's participating in and introducing him to other spaces is a good idea, of course, with the caveat that you have to make sure he's, in that transition period, that he's not going to be a risk to that other place. There needs to be some care in how that transition works. But yeah, shaking things up is a good place to start.
Yeah. Well, I like that idea because it's like that not only gives the victim the space that they need to continue to stay in a space that if they want to, right? Like if they want to stay at that school or at that activity or whatever, that is very supportive to them and helping them through their journey of healing from this experience. But then also giving that hopefully the perpetrator, as we know, this is just on hypothetical paperland, but being able to change the environment might actually stop that behavior, which could only benefit us all as a society.
Right. It's funny because all of the justifications for doing nothing after sexual violence is about it'll be bad for the perpetrator, it'll ruin their life. And I come from a perspective that perpetration is bad for the perpetrator too.
Yeah.
That it's standing in their way of meaningful connection. Even thinking about these like hyper masculine competitive spaces that they're involved in, that might give them some access to power, right? A lot of these places are places that get power. But the men in these organizations don't often feel valued within them. They don't often feel supported. They feel that competition and they don't ever feel like their spot is stable there. And so it's funny because there's this idea that intervening would be bad for the perpetrator. And actually it might be the opposite. It might be a good thing for all involved to put these kinds of consequences into place. And I do want to talk about victims a little bit too, because it is true that this can help in survivors' healing. One of the things researchers are increasingly finding is that how traumatic a sexual assault is not determined by the violence itself. That's one factor. But a big part of how traumatic a sexual assault is determined by how everybody else treats the victim and whether or not they feel valued and cared for. So if what the victim hears when they come forward is, well, we have to be fair to your perpetrator, what happened to you was horrible, but what about him? What the victim is hearing is, I'm not valuable to the other people in my life. And that creates this instability throughout their life, where now, instead of it being, I can't trust my perpetrator because he was violent, it's like, now I can't trust any of these people who tell me I'm less important than that person who was violent to me. But if in contrast, we do things to keep the stability in survivors' lives, to say you are an important part of our society, an important part of our friend group, of our, little corner of the world, and we want to keep you here because you matter. There's research that indicates that actually might make the sexual assault itself less traumatic. Some research finds that this is one of the best predictors of whether or not a victim will develop PTSD. Not all victims do. Victims who get support and who get care and who are told that what happened to them is not their fault are way less likely to have PTSD than people who are taught that they should blame themselves, that they are not important, and that they should take on more burdens. And one of the big things I found in my research is that a lot of what makes sexual violence hard for survivors is that their entire life is disrupted. If it's on their shoulders to be hiding from their perpetrator. If they have to listen to a lot of people talking about how great their perpetrator is all the time, these things lead to this unraveling of their lives. And other studies have found this too. Some studies have found that sexual violence history is the best predictor of a college woman's grades, the number one best predictor. It's also the best predictor of whether or not a woman who starts in a science, technology, engineering, or math, so a STEM field, it's the best predictor of whether or not they'll be able to complete their degree. That women who experience sexual violence in college are much more likely to have to change their majors, probably in large part as part of avoiding a perpetrator, or because their grades suffered the semester that they were sexually assaulted, and then they no longer meet the degree requirements because so many of these degrees have these really intensive weed out courses that are not particularly sensitive to survivors' trauma. And so it's all of these other forms of harm that lead victims from a place where in the immediate aftermath of their sexual assault, there is one trauma. But now they're being told that they are of low value, not just by their perpetrator, but then also by the professor in the class that failed them, by the department that's kicking them out, by the friends who say that they would rather have their perpetrator at social events than them. You know, all of these other people are telling them that they're low value. And that's where a lot of the harm comes from. And so again, it's not, when we're talking about doing the right thing, it's not just about changing the perpetrator. It's not just about that. It's also about literally making the sexual assault less traumatic and helping the victim keep their life in order and keep their life intact, which is something that requires a lot of cooperation from the rest of us.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking of a question that sometimes I hear people say, which is that, you know, women would make it up, right? So the victim has made this up. Did you find any correlation to that in your studies, that it really, lots of women are making up sexual assault?
There were no cases of that in the study. And I can say that not only because that's what the research tells us, is that false allegations of sexual assault are incredibly rare, and they actually also follow extremely predictable patterns. And so experts can tell them apart when we do see them. But also, I did get to evaluate the evidence for myself. And in all the cases where I interviewed a perpetrator, the perpetrators confessed. And so it was not complicated on my end. They would often confess and then justify the violence and talk about why the victim deserved what happened to them. But a trained professional should always see that as just a confession. Those justifications always come from perpetrators. On college campuses, the type of false allegation that is the most common is actually made by perpetrators. So it's something called a retaliatory complaint or a cross complaint, where a victim will file a complaint about what happened. And then the perpetrator, once they have been named in a complaint, so they wouldn't have filed this otherwise. It's after they know they're investigated, they will file a complaint back, basically just reversing things and saying the victim was the original cause of harm, or they will say that, the complaint itself is a form of harassment in some cases. And so I did see those. I did see those in the field of perpetrators who, the reason they file these complaints is for a few reasons. One is to engender empathy from people. There's this big response from perpetrators. Some people might have already heard about it, called DARVO, which is an acronym for how a lot of perpetrators respond when they're confronted with allegations of their violence. And it stands for deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. So they'll deny what they did, they'll attack their victim, and then they'll say they're the true victim as a way to engender empathy. And so that's one component of this. The other goal is to try to get empathy from other people and to try to confuse other people, to get them to say, I think of the most public example of this recently has been the Depp v. Heard case involving Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, where a lot of people threw their hands in the air and said, it seems like both sides are bad. Both people should be separated, but who's the real perpetrator here? Well, there is a real perpetrator. There's no such thing as mutual abuse. So there is one. And it's harmful to make it sound like the victim and the perpetrator, could be either person. But the other reason that they'll file these complaints and these retaliatory complaints is to try to convince the victim to withdraw their complaint and to remain silent in the future. So there's a really clear motive that's visible. And in some cases, they will say, I'll drop yours if you drop mine. And so I say all of this because when people think of, people making it up or making these false reports, they're picturing women and they're picturing people claiming that they're victims in that way. But what false reports really look like on a college campus is this other thing. They're mostly filed by men as a way to suppress claims about violence they very much committed. And a lot of the time it works. A lot of the time it works. We do not view men when they come forward about sexual assault with the same kind of suspicion, or when they try to, when they file these complaints. I want to put a caveat on that as well, which is when men are legitimate victims of sexual violence, they do face a lot of the same questions of credibility, but they're still not gendered in quite the same way. And the other thing is when men experience sexual abuse, there tends to still be a power disparity. So they are often much younger than their perpetrator, especially if the perpetrator is a woman. If the perpetrator is another man, then there's a stigma for it being a queer sexual assault, even if neither person identifies as queer. And so those are the things that lead to credibility deficits. That's the scholarly term for it. We call it a credibility deficit when male victims come forward. And in these retaliatory false reports, none of those dynamics are there because we're talking about a perpetrator who had power and control over their victim. And so that we tend to give them more legitimacy than they deserve. So it's all backwards.
Yes.
But that's what it mostly looks like.
Yeah. Man, it's frustrating. Like hearing this is like, not only I'm like, okay, this is so fascinating hearing all this, but then I'm also kind of like mad. Like I'm like, what in the heck? Seriously.
Yeah, I understand. It's really frustrating because it feels like it's all backwards in every scenario. It feels like we're picking the wrong side, no matter what's going on. That's one of the big findings of my research is that it didn't actually matter who was like what role a man or a woman had in a Title IX process. The men came out on top in all cases. And to be fair, all of the cases that I studied involved one man and one woman. That might be a little bit different if they were, a little bit different than that. But yeah, you would think, I guess I went in thinking that there might be a preference for the victim or for the accused. And actually it just came down on gender. It just came down on whoever the woman is going to be met with suspicion. Whoever the man is going to be trusted, and there will be this desire to protect him. And I was stunned by how consistent that was.
Yeah, it's shocking. I mean, but yeah, I can like think of circumstances, and even outside of, for me personally, just like outside of sexual abuse, just looking at our society in general, where there is a preference there, but like especially in sexual violence. Okay, so as we're talking about this, I should have defined this before, but when we're looking at sexual violence, what exactly does that mean?
So I use it really broadly.
Yes.
I'm talking about anything that can cause sexual trauma, anything that can disrupt a survivor's life. And the reason I talk about it so broadly is because researchers find that there isn't a hierarchy among sexual violence like people think. Like some people will think that rape is worse than sexual harassment, but they both produce the same traumatic impact, especially in power-laden environments like a university. So I define sexual violence in the book as sexual harassment, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, stalking, kidnapping, child sexual abuse. What else must I be missing? So many other things. Yeah. I know death threats, rape threats, all kinds of things that were happening from a gendered basis, where gender was invoked as part of how the violence was able to continue, and gender was invoked in the way people responded to it.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I don't think that as a society we have been looking at it through this lens. I think, you're helping me to see this so much differently. Although a lot of the things I already believed are in total alignment with you, it just seeing that, like, just that little shift and noticing that it is a real gender and power thing is fascinating to put into words, to just like notice that we're like perpetuating it too. Do you feel like schools and workplaces, environments that people are involved in are perpetuating the violence or kind of preventing sexual violence?
I think mostly perpetuating. Unfortunately, they say they're preventing the violence. There's this concept that I talk about in the book called symbolic compliance, which is essentially the way that organizations have tried to convince us that they are fulfilling civil rights law without actually changing much. And so if you think of the history of these schools, especially universities, most of them started only admitting men. They were male only, and gender integration was not that long ago. I just spoke on the phone with somebody who was in one of the first cohorts at Princeton that was gender integrated and talking about what that was like for her because
Oh
she's
my gosh,
still
yeah.
alive. And so we sometimes think of our schools, they try to convince us that they're on the forefront of these changes. And we often think of universities, these really liberal institutions. But for the most part, public universities and private ones, for that matter, are run by conservatives. The board of trustees are overwhelmingly conservatives, and they're overwhelmingly opposed to things like diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, sexual violence prevention. This is not something that they're doing willingly. And so since our government allowed them to choose how to implement civil rights law, which is the thing that makes sexual violence illegal on campuses. It's actually not sexual assault law itself. It's about the way it impacts education. Since we let them choose how to implement it, they did all of these things that looked good on paper to convince us that they're really working to prevent it. But actually, a lot of that stuff is totally toothless, or it's ineffective, or even worse, we know that it makes things worse. So for example, sexual harassment trainings in your workplace. We all find them frustrating, right? We all kind of make fun of like the online module that you have to click through for half an hour once a year that's teaching you, really basic stuff or these silly scenarios or whatever. Researchers have actually found that those sexual harassment trainings increase sexual harassment in the workplace. They're not just ineffective. They're not just annoying. They're actually dangerous. But we think of them as prevention, and our organizations tell us they're prevention. So that's a good example of what I mean when I say they're trying to tell us they're preventing things, but they're perpetuating it instead. And then I think another example is the definition of sexual violence that they use. And this is something, at the time we're recording this, we are literally like a few hours into the second Trump administration. But this is something big that his administration did the first time, and that is now back because of a federal court decision. But the Trump administration narrowed the definition of what counts as sexual harassment on college campuses. And to be clear, that is the thing that's illegal. It's not just sexual assault. It's sexual harassment is the thing that schools are supposed to respond strongly to, or anything that could be classified as gender discrimination. And the Trump administration tried to make that the narrowest possible definition, where now it's something, it has to be a recurrent problem. It has to be severe. It has to be an ongoing threat for schools to respond to it. Whereas before that, it was anything that met the definition of sexual harassment, right? It was anything, somebody made an inappropriate comment to you once, that was something that was reportable and that the school should have been looking into. Whether they were or not is a different issue. But part of what that has done on college campuses is they already didn't really want to be doing this stuff. They already did not choose to gender integrate by choice. And now they have this justification to look the other way when it's something that they see as, quote unquote, not that bad. And that's one of the things I really found in my research, is that the school administrators, they would have this idea of like the worst case they'd ever seen. And anything less than that, they would give a pass. I started to call it the Weinstein effect, because I was in the field the year after Me Too went viral, and I was hearing it in my field site and also out in the world, where there'd be these new stories of sexual violence perpetration, and people would react by saying, he's no Harvey Weinstein. And so you would think that the Harvey Weinstein story, it was intended to teach us a lot about tactics like grooming, hierarchies in the office, inequality in work industries, to help us see more things as sexual violence. But for a lot of people, they did the opposite, where they said if somebody is not that degree of a monster, if they don't meet that definition, which by definition, a 20-year-old cannot amount to the amount of violence that Harvey Weinstein has committed, that they would look the other way. And so, yeah, there are a lot of things that on its face looked like prevention, looked like a good response in the beginning, that then got contorted into a new way to justify even more violence than before.
Well, and I think, you can't look at the worst thing you've ever seen and be like, okay, this is now the thing. And then anything that does not meet this is not that big of a deal, because trauma is so personal. But I think we have a definition of what sexual violence looks like. And I think your fact that your research showed that women are not making this up should amplify the fact that we need a more broad definition, or at least just an adequate one, to be allowing women to come forward to say, this happened to me and I want to have a safe place on campus or at work or, wherever it is at my school. That seems so reasonable.
And I would say that I wouldn't even want sexual violence on a pedestal, right? That's one of the reasons
Yeah.
why it's so important to think about this as any kind of gendered mistreatment, including gender discrimination or sexual harassment too, is one of the things I've noticed in my research, and then also just like being a woman in the world, is that a lot of the time people will talk about sexual violence as if it's the worst possible thing. I think about it a lot in a dating context where somebody will go on a date with somebody, they did not have a nice time. They don't really like them that much. They don't want to see them again, but they'll feel this sense of, oh, I have to because he's like not that bad in comparison to the worst thing that's ever happened. He wasn't sexually violent, he wasn't abusive. And so, yes, the stuff he's doing is annoying, but I have an obligation to give him a second chance. Or once they're in relationships saying, oh, I shouldn't break up with somebody because they haven't done anything worthy of it. And so much of that is about centering the man involved. So much of that is about saying, as long as he hasn't broken like this worst rule, whatever we're defining as the worst treatment of a woman, that what you as an individual woman want and expect from your relationships is not even in the conversation. It's all about what he wants and expects and is entitled to. And so I think taking sexual violence off a bit of that platform to say, if something feels wrong, if it feels off, and I think this is helpful too, because it's so difficult for so many people to even define sexual violence, but to say, if it feels off and it's not the way you want to be treated, there should be more room to just say, this is not the way I want to be treated. And that shouldn't matter in all of my interpersonal relationships. I should feel respected and valued here on my own terms.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think that just makes sense. And yeah, I think how anybody, regardless of your gender, is, if you don't feel good about it, then we should be able to terminate that. But it also brings up the fact that I think it was in the 70s that you still needed your husband's permission to get divorced.
Right.
Right.
And that was in the Republican platform again. Platform again.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? To think like, okay, domestic violence, especially like interpersonal violence, like thinking about that, and you're like, okay, I got brave enough and I got all my stuff together to like leave this. I want to leave. And then to be like, actually, you can't. It's wild. It's so wild. And so in some ways we've made forward progression, and yet we're still at the beginning, right, of this process of helping victims, putting consequences for perpetrators, which I think, again, is an important part. So what are some specific strategies or changes that you found to be effective and created safer societies?
A lot of the stuff we've already talked about. It is really simple things like just having consequences for people who have caused harm and centering and prioritizing a survivor's needs.
Yeah.
I think this is really important to revisit right now, especially because a lot of what we've gotten from the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter is this co-optation, especially in school settings, of restorative justice. They're hearing a lot of people having a lot of opinions about what restorative justice should be. And it's really important to remember some of the fundamental tenets of why people advocated so hard for restorative justice and that they have to be present. And I think that some of these fundamental tenets are really helpful when we're thinking about what we can do as well. And, one of the first ones is the survivor is the center, the person who has been harmed. Restorative justice is not a checkbox that then you have to put the victim through whether they want to or not. Like, they're supposed to be leading that process. Everybody's process is supposed to be different based off of their specific needs, their specific context, how the violence disrupted their life. It's supposed to be voluntary, especially for the victim, but it's supposed to be voluntary. And there is room for consequences. I think a lot of people are seeing restorative justice and thinking it needs to be lenient, or I've heard a lot of people saying that it's a way to keep both people in the community. And that is absolutely not what the fundamental tenets of restorative justice are. It's supposed to be much more focused on supporting what the survivor needs. And like we've said before, the main thing the survivors want is to not be in the same community with their perpetrator anymore. And that used to be a really common result of restorative justice, was to remove perpetrators from communities. And so a lot of it is just doing things that are common sense. But the other thing I would say is be flexible in your thinking. A lot of people, when they mess up and they do wrong by survivors, the reason they do it is because they're thinking of some rule or some norm of how they think things should be. And
Mhm.
so an example of this is thinking about a victim of stalking in the workplace or a school setting. One of the places where victims of stalking are particularly likely to have encounters with their stalker is if they have to be in the same place on a regular basis. So if
Mhm.
you have to be at work at 9 a.m. every day, that's a place where your stalker can wait for you because they know you have to be entering and leaving the building at a specific time.
Mhm.
But if you are the coworker and you have a position of authority where you can offer some flexibility and say, we're not going to set any meetings for you for the first hour of the day. You can work from home sometimes, you can come sometimes. That can really reduce risk in a
Mm.
huge way, is thinking about what is causing the problem here and what are some alternative ways to handle it, and to be as creative and flexible as possible instead of saying this is the way things are done. Or a lot of people say, if I do it for you, I have to do it for everybody. That's not a good reason to
Mhm.
put someone in a violent situation. These are just not good reasons.
Yeah.
And so that's a big part of what I have a consulting practice now called Beyond Compliance Consulting. We work with organizations that really are interested in ending violence, not making it more palatable to their members, but actually creating these safe spaces. And that is so much of what we do, is we just ask survivors, what do you need? How is this still negatively impacting you? They will
Mhm.
give us an answer. And then if there's a policy or something that's standing in the way, we'll say that policy is enabling violence. That policy needs to go.
Yeah.
And something that I say a lot is, a lot of the time we have these conversations, we ask, people will say, like, as a victim, like, how can I get my perpetrator to change? How can I end violence? How can I make my perpetrator's violence against me end? And the answer to that is depressing. The answer is you can't, because of this power disparity, because sexual violence is a crime. And the reason it's traumatic is because of the loss of autonomy. You don't have the power as an individual to do that. But
Mhm.
if you ask me the same question, where I'm in a position of authority and a victim is coming to me and saying, can you make the violence stop? The answer is very often yes. That if I'm the one who can choose to separate two people, if I'm the one who
Mhm.
can offer the victim some flexibility or give the perpetrator some rigidity, that's often what
Mhm.
they need, is more rigidity, then we can actually do a lot to protect other people. And so a big part of doing this the right way and creating this safe environments is thinking a little less individualistically and thinking more about what are we capable of if we work together? Where are some things from my position I can do things? A lot of people, when they think about this stuff, they think like, okay, I want to write to Congress. I'm
Mhm.
feeling inspired after reading your book. I'm going to try to convince my school to change. And I always tell them to just kind of hold up a minute, send your letter. We love that too. We do want this to be a political objective, but think about the areas of your life where you're already in a position of power and you're
Mhm.
in a position of authority, and bring these teachings there. It is going to be as the supervisor or the teacher or the mentor or the parent. Those are the moments where you already have control. So wield it for good, right?
Mhm.
That's the main
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. Okay, so what do you want? I know you talked at the beginning, like what you wanted parents or people to take away from this, but if you're a parent listening to this, figuring out like you have daughters or you have sons, and there are things that we can do to help both sides of this, to maybe prevent our sons from being perpetrators and to protect our daughters from having to survive such trauma. What do you want parents to take away from this interview?
Ooh, okay. So I want to talk about this in a way that will start with the gender neutral things that will
Mhm.
benefit your daughters and sons at the same time. Then I want to talk about each group.
Okay.
But for the gender neutral, modeling egalitarian and respectful relationships in your home is really important between parents. If you can, right? We know there are people in abusive relationships that can't. But in that case, I would say labeling it what it is,
Mhm.
instead of trying to hide the abuse from your kids who are seeing it anyway.
Yes.
Giving them the tools to understand it, to know that it's not okay, to know that it's not something that they have to accept or replicate for themselves, is really, really important. And then if you can have a healthy relationship with your partner and in your family, to do that, right? And then the other thing is to think not just about the parents, but also with the kids. That for a lot of kids, they've been taught to sort of respect their father in particular as the be all end all. What
Mhm.
he says goes. And that can lead boys to think that's what I'm going to be when I grow up. And that's how people need to treat me. It teaches them a sort of sense of entitlement. And for girls, it teaches them, a sense of submissiveness. And so one of the examples that I like to give is, how do you be in an argument with your teenagers? Are you insisting you can't leave until your dad tells you can go? It's disrespectful to just walk out of the room. Or are you teaching your kids, and I think this is one that's good for boys and girls, that they can walk away, that they can also ask for space, and that men do not have ultimate authority. And then for their interactions with moms, one of the things that I think about a lot, I have a lot of young kids in my family right now, like really young toddler kids. And I'm amazed by how much they've been taught to be entitled to their mother's body, and that they've been taught they can climb all over their mothers, and that their mothers have to sacrifice all boundaries or else they're being a bad parent. And so I think that's something where setting some boundaries can be really helpful. And I know a lot of moms feel guilty, and I'm here to say, like, don't. That's actually a really important lesson for them to learn, that you have boundaries and that you can't be there for them all the time and you can't do absolutely everything for them. That's something that you want them to be able to see with you. And so having that life outside of your kids, to be able to say, sometimes, like, I'm on the phone and you need to wait. That kind of boundary setting from a really young age can teach kids a lot. It's kind of amazing. One of the big lessons of the pandemic about gender that we learned is, when everybody's kids were home and doing classes on Zoom, there were studies of how many times kids went to interrupt their moms versus their dads. And they interrupted their moms so much, and they left their dads completely alone because they thought their dads, deserved that kind of respect. That's the kind of stuff that, it's the gender dynamic as a whole. It's not just about sexual violence. It's about teaching that kind of egalitarian value from a really young age. And then when it comes to the sexual violence specific stuff, for boys, making clear that there can be abuses of power when they're young too. Being mindful of that is a really important thing for protecting them. And I think people think a lot about it with their girls, and their girls being around older men. People don't think about it as much for their boys, and you should. But then for boys, it's a lot of teaching them lessons of accountability, because for boys, a lot of them will age out of the risk of this type of violence as they get older. And so teaching them to be accountable for things that they've done that have harmed others, including helping them develop empathy for that harm. So not just the harsh consequence, that's one piece, is giving them a consequence that's appropriate. But the other piece is helping them understand and care for that other person, helping them practice thinking through how their actions impact other people, and also making them accountable for caring for other people. So some of this is about violent stuff, and some of it is about the only time we teach boys to care about empathy is when they hurt somebody, we have failed them. They need to learn to empathize and care for other people the whole way. And for girls, teaching them that they're not going to be punished by their parents when they come to seek help. I think that's one of the things I've found most gutting in my research. Is one of the questions I ask every survivor I've ever interviewed is, was there anyone you did not want to know about the violence? Overwhelmingly, survivors say their parents, because they worry they will be punished and blamed for what happened to them, that they'll get a lesson on, why did you let this happen, or why were you here, or why were you there, you should have done X, Y, and Z and the other. And what I found in my research is, a lot of the time when their parents do find out, their parents do punish them. So when girls have that fear, they tend to be right. And so the research tells us, don't blame your daughters, don't teach your kids. A lot of people want to teach them sexual assault prevention tips or self-defense and all these things. None of those things work. The sexual assault rate has not dropped at all since we introduced those interventions. So it's okay to let them go. The thing that's more important is to have open communications about sex, sexuality, and gender with them on a regular basis, so that if something happens to them, it won't be the first time they've ever talked to you about sex. And it's important that you let them know that that's the kind of thing they can talk about. That is the big predictor of which victims will disclose to their parents and which will not. And then the other thing I'll end on all the way around is to think beyond just your kids, right? And so go to their schools. When you're picking a college, ask about their victim advocacy program. Make sure it's well staffed. Ask about their expulsion rate for perpetrators of sexual violence. If it's low, and it probably will be, make a big show of disappointment. One of the things I learned from school administrators is it was mostly the children, when parents were coming and asking these questions, they they asked about sexual assault a lot, but a lot of the time it was the mothers of sons wanting to make sure that their sons would get impunity for sexual assault.
Wow, that's wild.
It's wild. And so for a lot of school administrators, they said, this is what our parents want. And the research does actually bear that through in some really depressing ways. When there are sexual assault scandals on college campuses, applications go up the next year because there is a sense of this is a place where, you know, my kids can't get kicked out. I don't know. We don't know why.
That's fascinating.
That was kind of the framework that people were talking about when I asked school administrators, like, what do parents say to you when they do these campus visits? Some were worried about their daughter's safety, but just as many or more were worried about their sons being able to stay in school no matter what they did. And so make sure, including if you're the parent of a son, that you would want him to be held accountable if he was being violent at school, that's one of the lessons that you want his school to teach him, and to make that really loud and clear, because there's an assumption that parents want the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Nicole. This has been such an enlightening conversation. I feel like I have learned so much in this time. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been so great to chat.
Thanks again, Nicole. That was all really helpful information. I hope that you gained some insight, some understanding, some ways to step into action, and ways to help support our kids with this conversation. If you liked what we did today, please rate and subscribe to our show. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. And also keep the emails coming with topic suggestions for future shows to accidentalexperts@gmail.com. Have a great day. Some words from our legal team.
The information presented in this podcast is not intended or implied to be a substitute for appropriate professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All content, including text, graphics, images, and information contained on or available through this podcast, is for general information purposes only. This podcast makes no representations and assumes no responsibility for the accuracy or information on or available through this podcast, and such information is subject to change without notice. You are encouraged to confirm any information obtained through this program with other sources and review all information regarding any condition or treatment with the appropriate professionals.
What we're saying is, yes, I am a real therapist, but I'm not your therapist.